Welcome to the very first episode of Thinking About Therapy. I'm delighted to introduce my first guest, Dean Boner. Dean is one of the very first people that I talked to about the idea of a podcast. He has supported and encouraged me ever since I introduced him to the idea, and I'm delighted that he's here as my first guest.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Dean has joined me today to talk about his own experiences of Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, or OCD. We have had quite a few conversations ourselves about what OCD is, but for anybody who doesn't know, would you be able to give them a little bit of an insight into what OCD looks like?
Well, I'll give you a psychiatric definition if you like. OCD is a disease, a mental illness that is characterized by intrusive thoughts. That's the obsession side of it, where thoughts come into the sufferer's head, as they come into anybody's head. But the nature of OCD is that thoughts that make them anxious, they can't just dismiss them, ignore them. They tend to stick, and then the person obsesses and ruminates over them. And then the compulsions come into play as a way to relieve the anxiety. So, for example, I'll just use a really simple example. Somebody who has a real fear of contamination, an intrusive thought about contamination, say about catching AIDS or COVID-19 or wherever it may be, the compulsive behaviour that corresponds to that is hand washing, excessive hygiene in the house, etc. Do you know what I mean? But the difficulty with that, and it's very important to understand with OCD from the start, is that while the compulsions give the sufferer short-term relief, they beget more obsessions, which in turn obviously begets more compulsions. So the instinctive thing that OCD sufferers do to try and relieve the anxiety and the tension that they're experiencing actually feeds and perpetuates it, and it becomes a vicious cycle. Another thing I will just note with OCD, and I'd like to dispel this straight away, is OCD is not synonymous with being meticulous or being house proud or just being very diligent or judicious in your daily life. It is not like that. The understanding of OCD in common parlance is people who like their picture frames perfectly aligned, who like things color coded, who like their books sorted alphabetically. That is not OCD. OCD is a highly debilitating illness. In fact, one of the 10 most debilitating illnesses according to the World Health Organization. So, yeah, it's worth bearing that in mind. It's not the trivial matter a lot of people seem to think it is.
As somebody with OCD, what is it like when you hear people say things like, oh, I've got OCD, or I'm so OCD about that?
Well, it's funny, I'm a very difficult person to offend. Most people's ignorance in any matter is water off duck's back for me. But I think it annoys me not on a personal level, but it annoys me because it distorts the whole narrative around OCD and the public understanding around OCD, which feeds into people's attitudes, people's awareness of it, and potentially, very possibly, feeds into government approaches to it in terms of health. So yeah, well, it doesn't upset me. It irritates me that the seriousness of OCD and the impact that it has on people's lives goes so unrecognised because of that common understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can understand that. In terms of your own experience, is OCD something that you had from a very young age, or is it something that developed over time?
It developed over time, but I wasn't aware of what it was for maybe the first 6 or 7 years that I had it. My first memory of having obsessive compulsive behaviours dates back to maybe when I was about 9, so that's almost 20 years ago now. And I remember the first two things I remember were I was sitting in the living room watching TV, I would be obsessed with making sure that the door was closed. Don't ask me why, I can't explain it, but I would obsessively check the door and go round. Sounds really strange, but like move my head in a rectangular motion around all four sides of the door to make sure that they were perfectly sealed. Another thing would have been obsessively checking my homework diary in the evening after I'd done my homework to make sure that I hadn't missed anything, because I had a pathological fear that the teacher would eviscerate me in the morning for having forgotten something. And then it snowballed from there, took various manifestations down through the years up to the present day.
And now, whenever you look back on that, and the first thing being for you about the door frame and making sure it's closed, do you have any understanding of where that came from or why that started?
I understand there was a bit of relatively minor upheaval in my life at that time. Nothing serious. Whether or not that caused the OCD, triggered the OCD, or it just happened to be coincidental and occurring alongside the onset of OCD, I don't know. But it's very difficult to, a lot of the OCD worries that I've had, a lot of the obsessions that I've had, which have led on to compulsions, I've not been able to understand them. And here's another thing that's very important to mention about OCD, is that people with OCD really, genuinely do not believe all the things that worry them. They know in their heart of hearts is daft. They know that the things that they think, the things they worry about, and the compulsions that they engage in to ameliorate that worry are irrational. But it doesn't matter, and that's the thing. That is the key thing. So whether or not you know where OCD comes from, and even if you know 100% that what you're worried about is ridiculous, it doesn't make a bit of difference.
Yeah, so that kind of, the thoughts in your mind, you might know that they're irrational. You might know that the compulsions that you're going to do aren't going to make any difference.
You always know that. You always know.
Would I be right then to think that it's the emotion or the anxiety that overrules that? That it maybe doesn't matter, the behaviour still has to be done in order to kind of overrule the anxiety?
That is exactly it. Because although you know in your heart of hearts, as I said, that what you're worried about, what you fear, what OCD is leading you to believe is not true, the anxiety is so great and so all-consuming that you cannot allow yourself to believe that. And OCD, some people used to refer to OCD as a doubting disease. And that's really opposite, because OCD makes you doubt yourself, makes you doubt everything around you, makes you doubt your character, your abilities, whatever. And it also makes you doubt, like, even though you, as I say, you know that what you're worried about is not rational, OCD keeps telling you otherwise, and you can't silence that voice.
You've talked quite openly in the past about your OCD, and I suppose I wonder if there are certain times where it's easier to do that than others, or I suppose if there are times where OCD has been more prevalent in your life. Do you ever feel like it's something that you can get a handle on, or do you feel like it's something that you will always be dealing with?
It's peaks and troughs, really, and it has been down through the years, or the last 2 decades. Yes, there are times when I definitely have a better handle on it, and there have been times, and it doesn't necessarily, like, I remember, for example, when I was at university, my second year of university, I was busier than I'd ever been before. I had my head firmly entrenched in the books. I was involved in various societies. I was working part-time, the whole lot. But I was in great spirits that year. The OCD, through various things at the time, just seemed to really subside to an extent that I could live a relatively normal life. But then going into final year, everything changed, and the OCD got a grip on me stronger than I probably had ever had before. And I can't, so I, while I would be tempted to say that there was a correlation between the OCD being really bad and you being in a really sort of difficult situation, or a situation where the stakes are very high, that isn't necessarily always true. And the thing I found about OCD as well is that even when you are in a good place, a thought can come in, you can see a trigger on the TV, whatever it is, and it can completely blindside you. It is really unpredictable in terms of whether or not it's always going to be something I'm going to have to manage. There are some therapists out there who claim that OCD can be completely cured. I don't personally believe that. I don't know. I haven't found or came across anybody who's completely gotten rid of it. It's one of those things that I think I'm always going to be managing, sometimes better than others, but the search for a permanent, or at least a very effective solution continues.
In terms of thinking about the therapy that you've had, particularly as it's something that it sounds like you've had since you were quite young, how did you engage in therapy, or how did you come about getting some sort of professional help for your OCD?
It didn't come about initially. Like, I can trace my OCD back to maybe, say, if it started when I was 9, I can't really remember. Something would be about 2001, so 20 years ago. Jesus. But the first time I sought help was, I think, maybe it was like October 2003. And at that time, the reason that I sought help at that time is because I developed a sort of medical and health manifestation to the OCD. As a child, I was quite into medicine. I had medical encyclopedias, various books on the human anatomy, on various diseases, etc. Seemed destined to be a doctor. But then the OCD seized hold of that passion of mine, and it convinced me that people around me were going to get terminally ill or were going to die. And the books, etc., they almost became tinder for that fire, and that I was constantly checking symptoms over and over again. So it was that, or checking symptoms that maybe people close to me were manifesting, or I believe they were manifesting, against deadly illnesses, everything from cancer to motor neuron disease and back again. But so yeah, that was the first time I sought help, because it was readily apparent to everybody in my circle at that time that I wasn't well, and I went to my GP, Maria Bradley. Can't sing her praises highly enough. And she referred me, I believe, to Child and Family Mental Health Services in Letterkenny. So that was the first time. And since then, that was helpful during that time. But since then, I've been to various different kinds of therapy with various different therapists of varying levels of competence, it must be said.
I suppose that's part of the reason for the podcast. It's talking about different people's experiences as much as everybody is comfortable. And thinking about, for you as somebody who has had different experiences of therapy, what are the things that were maybe helpful or unhelpful? I suppose I'm thinking about, if anybody is listening that has OCD or any other kind of mental health difficulty, what are the things that you would be encouraging them to think about if they were looking for therapy?
Well, I would say the first thing is, and this is fundamental to treatment and recovery from OCD, and as far as it's possible to do that, reassurance is not helpful. Reassurance feeds the fire, so any therapist who works on that basis is not the right therapist for you. And unfortunately, a lot of people, when they think of therapy, they imagine counselling, where a therapist is going to listen to you and help you to straighten out the kinks in your thoughts and the trauma, your attitude to the trauma you might have experienced in your life. That is not particularly helpful in OCD. That, because reassurance reinforces OCD. Unfortunately, the problem is a lot of people with OCD don't know that until quite late on, until their journey with OCD is quite advanced. And a lot of counsellors and therapists, even those who are well trained, don't know that. They don't know the limits of their competence. So a lot of people with OCD find themselves going into therapy where they're constantly being reassured and told their worries are irrational, and being allowed to explore their worries for an hour that costs €50 in a way that's actually detrimental to them. And that is something that I engaged in on numerous occasions with different therapists, and it was like the compulsion side of OCD, and that it was a bit of a comfort at the time, but ultimately it just fed the monster. And it was only in fairly recent years that I discovered that CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, coupled with the ERP techniques, are the gold standard in terms of talking therapy for OCD, because the whole focus on CBT is on confronting the OCD head on and then doing what you want to do and living your life in spite of OCD. It's about learning how to control. It's not about evaluating why the OCD is there. So that is the key thing, but it took me a long time to realise that, and unfortunately it seems to be the case that for a lot of people with OCD it takes them a long time to realise that.
So that idea that in some cases you can actually spend a lot of time trying to figure out where it came from, and actually that's not helpful.
It isn't helpful, but I would say, as me and you were saying before this podcast, talking to somebody is better than talking to nobody. Yeah. And often, whether we have OCD or not, going to a counsellor when things are distressing as a counsellor or therapist of any kind can be helpful, but it isn't the long-term solution to treating OCD, as I am painfully aware.
So in your experiences, it sounds like you've had times where you've gone in and, rather than, I suppose what I'm hearing is it's helpful for you to have tools and techniques to actually confront the OCD, and I suppose the impact that the OCD has on you. Perhaps if it stops you doing certain things, then some techniques and tools to work on that, rather than saying, okay, what's the worries you have, and let's evaluate if they're rational or irrational. Because you already know that they're irrational, so it sounds like what you want are tools and techniques to help you manage that anxiety.
Absolutely, because I should just explain to you that if you're being constantly reassured or seeking reassurance, that is actually a compulsive behaviour in itself that feeds further OCD. So when you go to a CBT session, well, my experience of CBT thus far is you can give a brief descriptor of what the worry is, but the whole focus is on what the solution is. How are we going to unwork this worry? How are we going to overcome it? How are we going to not let it be a roadblock in your life? That is a focus. It's solutions focused. And techniques, the techniques aren't anything particularly obscure, overly scientific. A lot of them can very much be summarized as doing what you want or need to actually do in spite of the OCD. So, for example, or not doing. For example, it might be no matter how contaminated you may feel feel that your hands are, no matter how much you feel you need to check that thing for a third time to make sure the house doesn't catch fire, that you don't do it. That is as simple as that. You don't do it. Or if you're afraid to go somewhere because you're going to bump into somebody who you think is a bad omen, because superstition can be a big element of OCD too, or whatever, you go. You don't allow yourself to be held back. The key thing in that is learning not to allow OCD to hold you back, but also, and this is key, tolerating the anxiety. Because when you go against what OCD would demand of you, you will get anxious. Your anxiety will increase. Sometimes it will overwhelm and blindside you. But it's learning to tolerate that. And the central tenet of CBT and ERP in that vein is getting to a stage where you've tolerated the anxiety so well that the anxiety starts to drip away. So that is the kind of center to the techniques. Techniques vary. They're very much tailored to the individual and what they're going through. But they're very simple tools. They're tools that it takes effort and a willingness to put yourself in the firing line of anxiety to complete them. But that's kind of the key. There's nothing more complicated than that.
I think in my experience of working with somebody with OCD, it is the techniques, and sometimes we say they're simple, but actually when they're not very simple when you're feeling very anxious. And also part of what I've noticed is that it's something that I sometimes describe as having a toolbox. So one technique that works in one situation might not work in another, and you sort of need to build up a bank of different techniques that you can use in different situations.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm thinking, I can only speak of my own experience. I can't speak of anybody else's. But techniques that I might use would be, if I've resolved that I'm not going to check something because OCD is demanding that I do, and the corresponding anxiety then comes, I will try and distract myself. I'll focus on the TV. If I'm watching the TV, I'll really focus on what is happening. If I'm reading, I'll really absorb the words. Might even just close my eyes and sit there and try and ground myself for a minute, hold on to the chair, feet flat on the floor, what have you. And there's various alongside that. So sometimes it's using. I mean, distractions aren't the cure, and I'm not a fan of that mindset of, oh, just keep yourself busy and you'll be grand, because that's not true. But it's distracting yourself from the emotion or turmoil until it starts to subside. That would be one technique. Another technique would be, sometimes it's just, if, like, for example, if you were finding that OCD was really getting to you in the house, sometimes you just need to get out, get away from it, walk away from it. There are, like, the techniques that I employ are very simple. They usually involve either doing something even though OCD doesn't want me to do it. I say that as if OCD is a gremlin on my shoulder, but that's just for convenience. Or not doing something that OCD demands, and then finding a way to distract myself until the anxiety starts to subside. Those are the kind of key things for me.
Mm-hmm. In terms of your own OCD and it being something that you recognise that you had from a young age, at what stage did you get a diagnosis, or was it acknowledged for what it was? Was it kind of misunderstood as anxiety, or?
I think it was initially deemed to be anxiety. Like, I dealt with a couple of therapists, as I said, with the Child and Family Mental Health in Letterkenny, who were fantastic. But the term OCD was never really used, and I didn't really believe it. I didn't know. What OCD was. I think the first time I maybe became aware of the fact it was OCD, maybe I was approaching 17. I don't know, and I got a definitive diagnosis when eventually I went to a psychiatrist about 10 years ago through the HSE, who diagnosed OCD. So it was. I mean, and this was my experiences. Characteristic of a lot of people's experience of OCD, and that they may go a year, 2, 10 years, not knowing what it actually is.
Yeah, I think that's what I've seen in my line of work. When people have come into me, it's often that they've been misdiagnosed or it's been diagnosed as something else. So a different type of anxiety rather than for what it is.
Yes.
Is it often that it can be very hard to trust someone enough to share with them fully the different types of thoughts and compulsions that you're having. And until you get someone that you have a good enough relationship with in therapy, perhaps that might also feed into not being diagnosed properly.
That does, without a doubt, and that's probably the biggest stumbling block, because a lot of the thoughts that people have with OCD are related to fear of harm coming to themselves, and very often fear of harming other people. So some classic manifestations might be a fear of knocking somebody down with your car, somebody who is afraid to, I don't know, it could be, for example, a nurse who's afraid to give injections in case she loses run of herself and decides to kill a patient with an overdose or whatever. It's those things. So a lot of the thoughts are very dark. A lot of the obsessions revolve around really abhorrent things. Now I should point out that those kinds of thoughts aren't the preserve of people with OCD. We all have those thoughts, believe it or not. Like the thoughts that people with OCD have, as deviant as they may sound, are as common in the general population as they are among OCD sufferers. The difference is people with OCD attach significance with them. Somebody who is afraid of knocking somebody down with their car may then start to believe that they have a genuine desire to do that. And that creates a problem in terms of therapy, because they often fear that they're going to be judged, or at worst thought to be the things they fear they are. And unfortunately that isn't an entirely baseless fear, because there have been a lot of instances where therapists who aren't trained and understand an OCD have indeed taken that line of thought. So that's another thing with, like, even when you go to somebody, they may not be able to, whereas somebody who's trained in OCD understands that. And this is the thing. This is the funny thing. People with OCD are probably the most trustworthy and safe people in the world, because they will go out of their way and alter and limit their lives in so many ways to avoid the possibility of harming somebody or hurting somebody or allowing something to happen through their own negligence or whatever. But yeah, that is the nature of those thoughts, and the torment that they cause people with OCD would be a huge barrier to a lot of them seeking help.
Yeah, just as you're talking about that, I'm thinking about that line that we say all of the time in appointments, particularly the first appointments, which is that if we feel like you're at risk, in terms of confidentiality, we'll keep confidentiality, but if we feel like you're at risk or someone else is at risk, so any other kind of vulnerable adult or child, then we'll do something about that. We'll break confidentiality for that reason. And so now, as I'm thinking about that, I'm also thinking about, in the context of somebody with OCD whose thoughts are around, who have no intention of hurting somebody, but sometimes that's what their thoughts are around. You know, to hear that sentence, that might jar with being honest. I'm saying these are the thoughts that I have, particularly if we've just met. You know, that person doesn't know that I've got experience or training, that I understand that it's just a thought. And so I suppose I'm struck by the amount of trust that it takes in order to be honest and be able to say, look, these are the thoughts that I'm having.
Definitely. And I mean, I think the thing is, the key characteristic of OCD is that the thoughts are almost always, no matter what the thought is, no matter what it relates to, they're they are generally absolutely groundless and baseless. And somebody who's trained in treating OCD will understand that. So they won't interpret it. Somebody saying, "Oh my God, my dog died," or "My granddad died, and now I believe that I played a part in his death," or something. I've had an intrusive thought that I covered his face with a pillow or something, which is the kind of thoughts that people have. Um, a cognitive behavioural therapist, or anybody who's skilled in treating OCD, will be aware that those thoughts have no base. So, and indeed, the only difference in somebody with OCD and somebody who doesn't is that they actually give voice to those thoughts. Do you know what I mean? So, that's the thing. But again, that fear of, like, people with OCD do, and I know I felt for a long time, that because I have these worrying thoughts about hurting people, about hurting myself, about, like, I remember when I was 12, for example, I took this is sort of classic example. I was in art class in school, and we were doing clay, like clay modeling, and the teacher was like cutting up the big pieces of wet, heavy clay off the block to dole out to the students, and she left the knife sitting down, and then she started to do some stuff, and I just happened to eye the knife, and the thought came into my head completely spontaneously, absolutely out of nowhere, that, oh my god, what if I lift that knife and stab her and kill her? And I remember just the panic, that sensation of that heat emanating from your gut and spreading down your limbs up into your head, your whole body just be sort of turning into a small scale inferno from the inside out. And then that was a catalyst for a month of overwhelming anxiety, crying fits, avoiding knives, avoiding any object that could hurt anybody in case I got an impulse to stab somebody. And that is, you know that is the nature of, like, that is how it works. And a lot of people, the thing is, with OCD, it's hard enough. It can be hard to find a therapist who understands that, but people in general population, I imagine most of them just wouldn't get that at all. And that is, but again, I suppose that's not just true of OCD. It's true of any mental health problem. Some people just cannot recognize and accept it as for what it is. Do you know what I mean?
And I guess, yeah, that's the idea behind some of the different podcast episodes I've been recording, is to try and get people to have conversations about these things that are happening, to open up some of those conversations and increase the awareness, to make it a little bit more accessible, and to take some of those conversations that happen inside a therapy room actually outside. In terms of your own, I suppose you've talked a little bit about it, the kind of peaks and troughs that you've been through. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the impact that OCD, or how you would categorise that impact that OCD has had on your life.
Catastrophic. It has completely distorted my view of myself. It has completely diverted me away from my interests, my ambitions. So many. I mean, at the minute, like, it's really, I know nobody's life is moving in a direction fast at the minute with COVID-19, but I mean, for me, the OCD has been really challenging for the last, I would say, 4 years. Last 4 years has been really challenging, and it has really gotten in the way of me proceeding with my career plans and going on to further study. It really has, like, I've just been kind of living and just living between my future and my past, with nothing happening in my life. And it's, even with therapy, even with medication, it's really, really, really difficult, because like, OCD makes you doubt everything. OCD can make you doubt whether it's safe to leave the house. So you can imagine how much it can make you doubt making significant moves or changes in your life. So yeah, for me, it has taken the last couple of years from me. Do you know what I mean? It really has. It's rendered me, for a while, it rendered me so unwell that I wasn't able to work or anything. Do you know what I mean? And it affects everything, because you can't do anything without OCD being part of it. OCD is always there. OCD attaches it to everything you do. And it just exhausts you, and it dominates so much of your time. Now, there's worse cases than me. There's people who spend their every waking minute of their lives engaging in rituals. I'm not that bad, but yeah, OCD really, and I suppose that's why it has been recognised as one of the 10 most debilitating illnesses in the world, because it really does cripple people.
Yeah, I suppose I'm thinking about those peaks and troughs that you've described, and actually that at times you maybe feel like it's more under control than others. For example, we worked together for about a year. I'm not really sure how many years ago it is now.
That was in Cooler, yeah, that was about 6 or 7 years ago.
And at that stage, as somebody who worked alongside you, and we drove up and down together, I would never have known that you had OCD. It's not something that's very obvious. And I suppose what I would also say, it wasn't even obvious at those times when you were probably feeling very overwhelmed with it. Perhaps because it maybe kept you in and kept you away from people.
It's, people with OCD are quite good at hiding it. In a way that you can. Now, they're probably not as good at hiding it as they think they are. People with OCD, I think a lot of us do come across as slightly eccentric and slightly odd. And I can imagine in Cooler, like, there would have been times that things I might have done or avoided doing or done in a particular way that some people there might have thought was odd. That would definitely be, but you don't. People, you do manage, like, when you have to function in a certain way, you do it. I mean, during that time that I was working in Cooler, I was often in a better place, so that then did change at a certain point. But it is something that you go to great pains to hide, without a doubt, because you don't want to open that can of worms. You don't want that Pandora's box to be infiltrated by other people, because simply the thoughts and the feelings that you have are so irrational and to you so abhorrent that you just don't want anybody to go there.
I'm thinking about, I wonder if it makes it harder in the harder times, because at other times you seem, and maybe it is a case of you seem to be doing well.
Yeah.
So does it make it harder for people to understand? Because, there seems like there was a period of your life where you were able, in terms of uni and working and keeping yourself quite busy and feeling quite good. Does that make it then harder for people to understand those kind of down times? And I suppose does it impact like the likes of being able to sustain a job? What's your understanding?
Well, I don't know how it would make other people think. You'd have to ask other people. We can never truly understand other people's thought processes. In terms of me, there was a time now, I would say, when my OCD was particularly bad in my sort of mid-childhood, pre-teen into the early teenage years, there was a time when it was really well managed. So I think back to maybe around the time I was 18 until I was 23 and went into the final year of my degree. The OCD was relatively well contained for the best part during that time. Now, there were times that were awful, but they were outweighed by, I think there was really, when I was 18, my life was so busy socially, in terms of work. That's when I started working in Cooler, etc. And it's not that I didn't have time to think. I think it was simply that the OCD was almost in remission to a certain extent at that time, and I was in such a good place that I was able to go back to education. I got done my leaving cert when I was 17. I'd done alright, but not enough to get where it necessarily wanted to go. So yeah, I did the exit poll and I was able to pass that with flying colours. And then was able to go on to Queen's University and study law. While I had that energy and I had that momentum going on, that actually started to slip away massively in final year. Like, I remember, like, as I said, the access diploma, I was in a really good place first and second year of my degree. I was in a really good place, but in third year, things really nosedived, and the OCD really took hold, and it wasn't, the year became a hell on earth, not because it was particularly difficult or because it wasn't enjoyable. It certainly wasn't because it was difficult, but it wasn't unenjoyable. I really did enjoy studying law. But because I developed a new strain of obsession, and it went like this. One day I was in a lecture, and I was like annotating the slides that I printed out. And at the end of the lecture, I felt like maybe my writing was a wee bit scrawly. The notes weren't very neat. They were a bit all over the place. And this thought came into my head that, oh my god, you better go to the library now and print those slides out again and write the annotations again neatly, because otherwise you might misinterpret something you've written at exam time and fail your exams. So I went and did that day, and that turned into about 2 or 3 months of writing and rewriting lecture slides. Every lecture, going to every lecture with the slides printed out, taking down notes, then going back to the library and rewriting them. And if I made a small mistake when I was rewriting, I couldn't just screw it out. I had to go and print the slides again. It took up months of my time. It cost me, I would say, easily over £100 in printing credit. And it completely diverted me away from what I should have been doing, and that was studying in a smart fashion in a way that was going to get me the class of degree that I wanted and was going to fulfill me intellectually. I was able to put, with a great deal of therapy, with the help of my GP, etc., I was able to put that to bed at the time, sort of put it in a box, and throw myself into the stuff that I actually should have been doing in final year. But yeah, although the OCD very nearly derailed me, and it was only by being really tough with myself to the point where it was actually hurting me in a way that I was able to push through. But then after graduating, then the OCD, it never really went away again. And in terms of how it affected, you were saying earlier, because I think we've gotten a bit off topic here in terms of how it affected me at work and all. After graduating, I took up a job with a corporate law firm in Belfast, which was the best paying graduate job that was available in Belfast at that time. Was a pretty good working environment in most ways. Not necessarily my ideal, but in most ways. But the issue that then cropped up with OCD was the central thing about the job was e-discovery, and it was so e-discovery, for those outside the legal fraternity, is where you review documents that could be relevant to litigation on either side for relevance to the litigation, and then you decide whether or not they can be disclosed to the other side or not, whether they're privileged or not. I developed a pathological fear of missing something that was important, and either getting rid of a document that was relevant to our client's case, or missing an instance of privilege and also allowing a document to be sent to the other side. So I became so diligent that I went through every document very slowly with a fine-tooth comb, and I was doing maybe half, some days a quarter, of what we were targeted to do every day, which then raised eyebrows with my team leader, who I have to say she was really helpful, and when I explained my OCD to her, she was really resourceful and went out of her way to try and help me to overcome it. But it really, that's the thing, like I am a naturally diligent person. I don't miss things. I don't make cock-ups like that, but OCD told me that I would, and therefore I had to be. So the protection mechanism actually became my undoing to a certain degree. And that's the problem with OCD, and that OCD masquerades as your friend, as somebody who's going to help you, as somebody who's going to steer you away from danger and steer you on the right path. It actually does the complete opposite.
I suppose what I'm struck by, I'm not sure if you said it today, but I've certainly heard you say it before, is that idea that OCD can take away the things that you really like.
Yes.
And I know that you loved your job, and I know that you love your when you were studying, you were very passionate about that, but your OCD seems to have tainted that.
Definitely big time. I mean, it's really, it tainted when I was a child. It tainted my interest in medicine. It went on to taint my belief that I was safe to be in certain social situations, and therefore made me avoid certain social situations I would normally have enjoyed. It tainted my enjoyment of my career. It made me all super fearful of getting something wrong. So yeah, that's it. It is. I think that OCD often seizes upon the most enjoyable, the most pivotal aspects of your life, and turns them into what you perceive as being dangerous territory that must be avoided.
Mm-hmm. I suppose in keeping with that, one of the things I'm thinking about is, you mentioned it earlier in relation to sometimes people with OCD can have eccentric characteristics. And I don't think you're eccentric, but I suppose what I'm saying is,
you're a rarity.
you know, you're a really jolly person. You're very friendly. You're very open to talking to people. You're sociable. You're outgoing. You're very, everybody has great crack with you. But I'm struck by the fact that when you describe your OCD, it almost feels like it's the exact opposite to that.
Definitely. I mean, it's not that I put on front. It is. That's like how you've described me. I would like to think it's my natural disposition. Again, I don't think we can evaluate ourselves in those terms without sounding like a pompous pig. But the thing is that my life, and I'm sure the life of most people with OCD, is a constant conflict between their natural, genuine selves and the concept of themselves that OCD has built up for them. And the whole battle, really, OCD can be summed up as you trying to be yourself, to live your best life, to project yourself as you want to project yourself to the outer world. It's constantly striving to do that and not allowing OCD to bulldoze you in the process, because it's almost like you're trying. It's almost like OCD is almost like, I don't know. It's almost like you're walking along, trying to live your life, trying to do your best and find the best way through, enjoy life. But OCD is this, it's almost like a whip. It's like somebody coming behind you and flogging you in a way that really hinders your ability to be your natural self. So I mean, that is the big thing with OCD. I mean, people with OCD, there's people with OCD who are eccentric, there's people with OCD who are gregarious, outgoing people. There's people with OCD who are reserved, reticent, retiring people. Do you know what I mean? People with OCD have a multitude of different personality types. No different to the general population. But OCD can, I suppose, as with many other mental illnesses, it can really distort that person's concept of their own identity, and can distort it to the extent that their outward identity and their expression of themselves becomes distorted or becomes sort of rolled back or watered down. I mean, I know myself, like, there are times in my life where I just can't be myself, where I just can't be around people because I cannot cope. Like sometimes I avoid social situations because I'm worried that a multitude of thoughts are going to come into my head, or whatever is discussed in the social situation, whoever is going to be in the social situation is going to trigger some aspect of the OCD that's then going to cause me to become very withdrawn within that company. And that is the thing. It's a constant tension between who you are, how you see yourself, and who you actually want to be, and what OCD tells you you are and how you should be.
And I suppose managing that is what you have been doing, and what you'll continue to do.
That's it. That's very much easier said than done, and it's easier for some people than for other people. Like, there've been people with OCD who have been absolutely wonderful academically. There's people who have gone to study medicine, who have qualified as GPs, psychiatrists, whatever it is, but have had to withdraw from their careers because OCD has just completely taken over to the extent where they couldn't even see a patient without coming away mired in anxiety, fearing that they did something wrong or missed something. It really does. Like, OCD really, it's a thief of joy. It is the thief of potential. Do you know what I mean? And that is the price that we pay for trivializing OCD in society, and that's because we have, well, not all of us, but because the dominant view of OCD is merely as a personality quirk, we don't allow ourselves to be fully aware of the far-reaching impact that OCD has on people's lives, and not just their lives, but the people around them.
Is that something that you have found, that it's had a knock-on impact on the people that are in your life?
Definitely, because it, well, I mean, if you're living with somebody who's constantly down the dumps and afraid to do anything and prone to crying fits when things are really bad or whatever, I mean, that's going to, like any mental, like living with anybody with a physical or mental illness, that's going to have a knock-on effect. No different to how if you're living with somebody who's going through chemotherapy, that's going to affect you. Do you know what I mean? And the thing is, again, people with OCD are just as they are aware that the thoughts that they have, the compulsions they engage in, are irrational, they're also aware that their suffering becomes transferred to an extent to those around them. But the problem with OCD is that despite that awareness and how acute it may be, the weight of OCD overshadows that in a lot of cases.
From what you said today, from our conversation, and I suppose the other conversations that we've had prior to this, it sounds like you've been quite well supported with your OCD. In your experience, has there been much support offered to those people around you, you know, like the people that you've lived with or that you grew up with and things like that, in terms of, have they been offered support in order to also support you?
It hasn't been, although it has been mooted. Like, the therapist I'm seeing at the moment has said that if anybody in my house wants to speak to them, obviously not regarding the minutiae of my OCD, because that's obviously strictly confidential, but regarding what OCD is and how it works and how it has an impact, that she'll be willing to. But I don't believe, like, it is one of those things, I suppose, now that you've highlighted, I hadn't really thought about it before, that the services and the availability of services to people with mental health problems are fairly good, but still not where they should be. There doesn't really seem to be much in the way of support for those people that are living with, or married to, or in a relationship with somebody who has OCD or another mental illness.
I think that's true for somebody not just with OCD, but any sort of mental health difficulty.
I think it's definitely something that needs to be, I mean, you know, like, the thing is, there wouldn't need to be a specific, in my view, a specific service for family members of people with OCD, because OCD manifests itself in a very similar way to other mental illnesses, be it clinical depression, generalized anxiety disorder, anorexia, bulimia. It manifests itself and causes the same kind of distress for those around them. So I think a general support group for friends and family of people with mental health problems would be a fantastic thing. I mean, I know, for example, that with Alcoholics Anonymous, in parallel to the group for people for recovering alcoholics, there's also a group which offers support to the family of people recovering from alcoholism. So yeah, I think that's something that definitely has legs in terms of mental health, and more than that is probably vital.
Yeah, it's maybe not something that I've thought an awful lot about before, but I guess just as we were having that conversation, it was kind of striking me that that might be important.
But even for me, in terms of relationships, the last relationship I had 6 years ago, it doesn't make me sound like a warm, alluring person at all, really, does it? But the joy of that relationship was subdued and erased to a great extent for me because I developed obsessions around. I had a pathological fear at that time that the guy I was seeing was going to develop cancer or a terminal illness and die. So there you go. That is the thing. It's almost like anything good in your life, OCD swoops in like a vulture and attempts to drag it, or at least the happiness that you derive from it, out of your hands.
And I think that's what I'm struck by. I've certainly heard you say it before this, that it's like a thief.
Yes.
Dean, I'm really struck by how open and honest you've been, and I'm really grateful that you have been with me. And I think that we both know there's lots of people out there who have OCD who have never sought help, and I think some of that information that you've provided today might be really helpful for them in terms of that advice about how important it is that they find the right person who's well qualified and well experienced to work with them. I think that's a really important message that you're sending in terms of how to find support. And I don't think that is information that's out there and available to people.
I think when you say that, yes, what I have said I would hope would make people maybe reconsider going to counselling, pushing past their fear of disclosing their experiences to people. But I think what I've said I would hope would also resonate with people who are suffering with OCD, particularly those who may not be aware that they're actually what they're suffering with is OCD. That they are not mad, they're not bad, they're not deviants, they're not an aberration in society, that they are good people who are deserving of help. And that's something that I would like to, because the person with OCD, the thoughts that they have and the beliefs that they might have about themselves because of OCD are no different than the person with anorexia or bulimia who might be thin as a rake but sees himself as being fat and of needing to lose weight. I mean, it's often like anorexia and bulimia come under the same umbrella as OCD in terms of that distorted thinking. So I would hope that not alone, but anybody listening who has OCD, who's looking to seek help, that they might be able to reach out, but also that they would understand. I know OCD doesn't allow us to understand this easily, that they are suffering from a serious and a very real mental health condition. They are not bad. They are not the things they fear. That for me would be really important because myself, it took me a long time to come to that realization. And if I'm totally honest, on the bad days, the fact that I've realized that counts for nothing because the weight and dominance of OCD still makes me believe that I'm a reprobate at times, and that is one of the more difficult things. But it's easier to push past that if you're actually aware of OCD, how it operates, what its characteristics are. It's much easier if you're aware of all that to understand yourself and to not view yourself as being a monster. So yeah, that would be very important for me.
I suppose if somebody is listening and thinking about reaching out for help, I suppose what I would be saying is go and speak to your GP. And from what you've said today, it sounds as though that was really the stepping stone for you accessing help.
100%. And I'm always kind of wary of people who maybe seek out private therapists themselves without going through a GP first, because you don't really know what you're looking for, no matter how much research you've done. And that is, for example, how I would have fallen into the trap of going to see people who weren't trained in dealing with OCD or in cognitive behavioural techniques. I would say, now, Unfortunately, my experience, well, my GP throughout my life here in Buncrana has been Maria Bradley, and she has always been resourceful and helpful above and beyond her call of duty. Not every doctor that I've spoken to has been particularly helpful. Indeed, one or two that I encountered over the years were actually dismissive of the idea of OCD. But I would like to think that most GPs don't have that attitude, and that most GPs at least have a cursory awareness of OCD and how it fits into the framework of mental health conditions, if you like. And if you find the right GP, if you're able to source out a GP who is compassionate, who is understanding, who has experience dealing with people with mental health conditions, then that's the right place to start. Because what happened for me, the start of the treatment regime that I am now on, came from going to my GP, who I've known all my life, who probably knows me better than I know myself, who was able to see what was going on in my life, was able to take a sort of big picture view of it, and then made the referral to a psychiatrist within the HSE, who was able to make the concrete diagnosis of OCD. And that psychiatrist in turn referred me to a cognitive behavioural therapist within the service, and now I'm dealing with, I'm getting CBT every week, but my cognitive behavioural therapist is working alongside and in collaboration with my psychiatrist. So there's that constant exchange and that confidence between the therapy that I receive, but also the medical background to that. And it's in terms of I'm also taking medication. I started a new drug. I'm not advertising for any pharmaceutical companies by saying this, but for me, starting a new drug in October last year, that was really pivotal to my treatment. I started taking sertraline, which is the class of SSRIs. It works for me. It won't work for other people, and other people may not be able to tolerate that particular SSRI the way I have been. But what it's done for me over the last couple of months, it hasn't made the OCD go away, but it has made a lot of the anxiety subside to the extent that I'm much better able to engage with the CBT and the techniques that come out of that. None of that would have happened if I had gone and sussed out a therapist off my own bat without going to a GP first. So I would actually say it's not even that it's a good idea, that it's prudent to go to a GP to navigate your pathway to the health you need. It is vital, because like it or not, for a long time I myself was reluctant to take a tablet, and I was reluctant to change the medication that I was taking because I feared that I might have undesirable side effects, or it might not work, or yada yada. But here's the thing, the CBT has only really started to work for me since taking the medication. So I do think that combination of the therapeutic and the pharmaceutical approach it works for me. Again, it won't work for everybody else, but it has been shown to be the most effective pathway. Medication on its own is not a cure. CBT or therapy on its own is not a cure, but the two in combination offer the best chance of navigating your way through OCD and not allowing it to take control of your life. A bit and we shouldn't think of it as being any different to physical illness. We know if somebody has cancer, the best treatments for cancer is often a combination of surgery, chemotherapy, and radiotherapy. Do you know what I mean? It's no different to that. And, that's, before I veer off topic altogether, that is the situation that I'm in now, and the supports that I have in place all started with my GP. So I would implore anybody who's seeking out help, don't go and suss out a therapist off your own bat. Go to your GP. If your GP is hostile, unhelpful, find another GP. Seek out another GP. If the services that your GP sends you to aren't particularly helpful, go back to your GP and raise that. But that's the starting point, I would say, and I would strongly advise anybody, not just with OCD, but with any mental health condition, to start there. And there is a myth too that most GPs' solution to somebody who presents with a mental health problem is to throw a prescription for pills at them. That's not true. That is not true. It is true to say that medication can be a very helpful and very significant element of treatment for some people, but it's not. My GP has, beyond prescribing me sertraline, she has obviously, as I've mentioned, referred me to the services, mental health services. She has tried to inveigle me to join the Swilly Swimmers, which, to an extent, she's been successful, but I couldn't bear the biting cold in November or December, so I gave up on that for a while. She has she's recommended, like, she's even gone so far as to recommend books or TV shows to watch to help distract me when the anxiety. So, I mean, that's the thing. There is a holistic approach to dealing with OCD. You're not going to find the solution through medication. You're not going to find the solution through talking to somebody. But a combination of therapies will lead you on the right path, and that all starts with seeing your GP.
Mm-hmm. And I think a huge takeaway from that for me is something that I often say as a psychologist is that if you don't find the person you're working with helpful, to try another one. And I suppose that's true of a GP as well. If you're accessing support with a GP and you find that, you know, they're not being responsive or open to what you're saying, then, you know, try and speak to another one. And I suppose it's unfortunate that might happen, but what I would say is don't let that put you off accessing help.
Definitely. And I mean, you have to remember, like, with GPs, with most doctors or medical or healthcare professionals, irrespective of their attitude or their level of learnedness with regard to mental health problems, they've gone into the job, many of them, I think, primarily to help people, not for the big wages, because, I mean, the shit that they have to deal with on a daily basis and the amount of bureaucracy they have to deal with kind of detracts a bit from the swanky lifestyle. So the majority, they are there to help you. Do you know what I mean? And even if they don't get it entirely right, it doesn't mean they don't have the best of intentions. And increasingly, GPs are trained to deal with mental health problems. The younger GPs coming through now, it's not to dismiss the older ones, have a much more acute awareness. So there's nothing to fear from that. I will just say one thing. You were talking about if you think your counsellor or therapist isn't helpful. One thing I have found is that I used to believe that a therapist had to be warm, fuzzy, friendly, talkative, convivial to be a good fit for you. You had to build a kind of personal rapport with them to that extent. That isn't necessarily true in my experience, and one of the problems with that is I have found myself going to therapists who are lovely people who would chat to the cows come home about anything, but what happens there is you spend half the session, often a session you're paying for, talking about matters that are completely irrelevant or at the very least tangential to what you're actually there to do. I have actually found that sometimes dealing with a therapist who is a bit more direct, who kind of steers the conversation very much between the ditches, if you like, is a much better approach. I mean, put it this, so some people, you might find your therapist, your psychiatrist, maybe, or indeed your GP, blunt, maybe quite stern at times, very direct and very unwilling to allow you to go off on a tangent. That is not a sign that you found the wrong person. That is, to me, a sign that you found the right person, because that's what you need to do to get the value out of your treatment. You need somebody who, like a tough rugby coach, keeps you on the road to recovery, doesn't allow you to divert, and doesn't allow you to lead the sessions. Because I think when you allow people with mental health problems, some of us, to lead the sessions, we don't lead them in the right way. So you need somebody, put it this way, on balance, better to have a maybe slightly stern psychiatrist, GP, or cognitive behavioural therapist who really has your best interests at heart and helps to guide you to the solutions to what you're experiencing, and to have a therapist who's as sweet as pie but spends half the session chatting to you about the weather. Do you know what I mean? That's one thing. So, analysing what is the right therapist for you, while a certain rapport is important,
It's got to have that.
it has to, the therapist has to almost have a very strict headmastery manner. It has to, and I mean, I know, like myself, like I've gone to therapists, no, not name anybody, but I've gone to therapists where I've paid, or rather my mum, when I was a teenager, paid €50 an hour, and 2/3 of that hour on some occasions were dominated talking about subjects that were completely irrelevant. And I mean, that's not necessarily because I think it's because some therapists they simply don't, like, they don't understand that every minute counts, that everything you need to be doing it's not to say you can't have small talk, but the focus very much has to be on where you're going. And it's also important, I think, I would say, that you need to, with therapists, It has to be evidence-based stuff. Like, there's a reason that I go to CBT, because CBT has been proven scientifically to have efficacy in treating OCD. Not for everybody, but for most people. There's little to no evidence that other talking therapies help, and in fact, there's tentative evidence that some of those talking therapies are actually detrimental. So that would be my thing. Don't be afraid to go to your GP. I would actually implore you to do it. And don't be put off if your therapist, your GP, or anybody else you're dealing with is a bit stern. That might actually be just what you need. Because OCD, I think people with OCD, one of the big characteristics about OCD is an inability to bring discipline to bear on your thoughts and your feelings and your anxieties. If you have somebody who has a bit of a sergeant major aura about them who's able to do that, that's a fantastic thing.
Is there anything else that you think is important for people to know, or any other kind of pieces of advice that you would give? And I think you've given lots of great advice already. There's been, lots of great tips and techniques, and I think lots of things for us all to think about, both people, anybody with OCD and anybody who is around or wanted to know a little bit more about OCD.
I think it's important, I think it is important to realise, as I've said before, and I cannot say this enough, that you're suffering from a mental health condition. You aren't a bad person. And anybody who is unable, that you talk to, is unable to make that distinction, isn't somebody worth having in your life. Do you know what I mean? But I think it's also important to recognise, having said that, and something we didn't discuss, that yes, while talking's good and a problem shared is a problem halved and all that dross, you don't, and it's not that you need to, because I'd be a hypocrite to say right now in the present circumstances you shouldn't be open about your experiences, but you can't expect everybody to understand, and you can't expect everybody to provide a solution. And in fact, as I've alluded to throughout the chat, that seeking assistance from people can actually be detrimental, because it veers into reassurance, which perpetuates the vicious cycle of OCD. So you don't need to, I think it's better to talk to people who you can trust, who get it, than to sort of tell your story to everybody you meet, because it's not going to be helpful for you. So be selective in who you talk about, be selective in who you trust, because like anything in life, not everybody's going to get it. And also, in talking about it, I still do it. I think everybody with OCD does it to a certain extent. We crave reassurance. We sometimes seek it in very overt ways. Sometimes we're very subtle. We become very adept at seeking reassurance without it appearing that we're doing that. You need to stop that, because as long as you're doing that, it's you need to learn to, and it's much easier said than done. You need to learn to trust yourself. I would also say, don't whatever, like, one of the things for me that I have found is OCD has distorted my the path that I've chosen, etc., to a certain extent. But hold on to that path. Don't let it go. Like, some people will advise you, like, if something's too difficult because of OCD, to not do it, or to avoid it, or to change tack. Don't do that. If you really want to be something, or really want to do something with your life, or really want to take your life in a particular direction, hold on to that, even though OCD makes you want to drop it. Because there have been too many dreams that have died, and too many lives that have been wasted through OCD and indeed other mental health conditions. You can learn to live with it. You can learn to push past it, to do what you want to do. It will not be easy, and OCD I believe it will. I don't believe OCD to be curable, but you can manage it. It's like any chronic condition. It's like having diabetes, having asthma, having, eczema, or whatever it is. It may not go away, but you can manage it, and you can lead a happy and fulfilling life. And I will also say that's another big thing. Do not expect that you're going to be cured. And any therapist who tells you that you can be completely cured of OCD, avoid them like the plague, because it's snake oil. It's not the goal. The goal is to learn to be able to control OCD via CBT techniques, via using medication, whatever methods that you decide to employ, so that you can very much keep OCD in the background of your life and fill the foreground with all the stuff you love.
I think that's a really fitting and a really valid message, I suppose, for us to kind of end on today, to try not let it derail your plans and to still keep the focus on those goals and things that you would like in life.
Now it's very easy to give advice, much harder to take it yourself. But that is anybody listening can hold me to that now, because I've now encouraged other people.
Will you leave it there?
I think so. You're very welcome.